Well, welcome to Garland Farm. I'm just gonna settle with this microphone for a minute here, and then Rick might have to make some adjustments. Welcome to Garland Farm and Beatrix Farrand Society's first program of 2023. Nice to see everybody here. My name is Christine Pelletreau, and I'm the chair of the programs committee. I'd like to personally thank you all for joining us today in person, and for those on Zoom, thank you for joining as well. And I just wanted to say that if you have any questions to the Zoom audience, please put those questions in the chat and we'll ask them at the end of Rick's talk today. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I would like to introduce a new member of the team here at Garland Farm. Her name is Katie Travers, and she's sitting over there at the table. Katie officially joined us about a month ago. She will be here every Thursday to help run our open days, help us run our office, and assist with our programs. Katie is a dynamic and talented addition to the Beatrix Farrand Society, and we are so delighted to have her here. So go up and say hi to Katie. With that, I'd like to turn to today's guest, Rick LeDuc. Excuse me, Rick. Rick is the garden manager at Thuya Garden, and he is here today to talk to us about pollinators. People typically think of pollinators as bees and butterflies, but in his talk, Rick will discuss a wider array of insects. They'll be considered not only for their crucial parts that they play in pollinating, but also their other vital roles in the ecosystem. In addition to providing pollinators with lots of flowers, Rick employs numerous other gardening practices, which he will touch on today as well. With that, please welcome Rick.
Thank you. Is this right? Yeah, thank you all for coming, and thanks to the Society for inviting me. Like you said, we're going to talk about pollinators today. And I'm sure we've all seen news items about pollinators in trouble, and they are. They face a lot of threats, and it's part of an overall decline in insect population, which should matter to us a lot, and we'll get to that. But first, I want to talk a little bit about these news things we see, especially in the popular media. And usually, they eventually land on discussing honeybees. Honeybees are under a lot of threats. We read about parasites, disease, extreme weather events, all of which are true. And it is a crisis. But as you may probably know, the honeybees are not native to the area. And in fact, they're considered domesticated, and the Department of Agriculture considers them livestock. So the honeybee crisis is important. We should all care about it, but I didn't do that.
They're not native to Maine or to
They're not native
US?
to North America. It's a European honeybee species. But it is an agricultural crisis, not an ecological one. So our native pollinators co-evolved with our native plants. And so our wild areas, have this intimate relationship, if you will. Honeybees will pollinate some native plants, but there are no native plants that depend on them for pollination, unlike some plants that do depend on, say, bumblebees for pollination. So it's something that's important to remember when reading about this. And our native pollinators share a threat, most of the threats that honeybees share. There's another obstacle which they face, and that's honeybees. Pollination is an act of foraging. for the insects. They don't wake up in the morning and go, oh, let's go pollinate some flowers. They wake up in the morning and say, let's go get something to eat. And so they go out there to collect nectar, or in some cases, pollen. And honeybees are competitors for that food. A recent study in Montreal, they had done a pollinator survey prior to the pandemic. And then when the pandemic hit, when people were done with their sourdough bread, they took up beekeeping. And there was a big increase in the Montreal area about beekeeping. They repeated the pollinator survey and found significant declines in native pollinators. And those declines were greatest where beekeeping had increased the most.
Interesting.
And I'm not saying that to make honeybees out to be, villains, because they're not. They're amazing animals, and I love honey. But truth is, it's not quite the same as the ecological crisis that we're facing. And so I want to talk a little bit about an ecosystem. So as you can see, we have producers, which are basic, which are plants. And then you have on the left there, primary consumers, herbivores, and then you have carnivores, and then you have detritus feeders, decomposers, and all that. I picked this slide off the internet, partly because it's misleading. And like a lot of us would think, if you mention herbivores, we're going to think bunnies or squirrels or deer. But really, if you think about the whole ecosystem, in which is this food web, is the flow of energy through the system, starts with the plants, goes through the herbivores, goes to the predators, and the stability of that ecosystem depends on all the pieces, keeping that energy flowing. It's not mammals. The insects are doing the bulk of the work. If you were to take an acre of forest, say, and weigh all the herbivores, and the insects would weigh the most, more than all the deer and squirrels and mice put together. And they would also be moving more energy through the system. So the stability of the system depends on all these pieces working together. There's a few things in ecological circles. Usually the complexity of the system makes it more stable because you have redundancy with the roles and everything. And they used to use an analogy that an ecosystem is like an airplane flying along, is held together by rivets. And if you lose a rivet, each rivet is a species. And if you lose a rivet, well, the plane's okay. But if you lose a couple more, it's more stress on the other rivets. And at some point, you're going to lose so many rivets that the plane's going to crash. We don't know how many rivets we've lost. We do know that a lot of them are weakening as insect numbers decline. But the whole system, we're gone past worrying about endangered species. We need to worry about endangered systems because they are, those are all rivets and they're all important in their own way. So that's the grim news. So we'll move along to the pollinators, and which pollinators are more, are most important. Well, they're all important in their own way, but bumblebees are kind of the rock stars. They have adaptations which make them really good pollinators. They have big hairy bodies, which allow pollen to stick to them. They can vibrate their wing muscles and warm themselves up in cold weather, so they can fly around when other insects are, still shivering, or not shivering, I should say. And they can do buzz pollination, which is essentially getting in a flower and vibrating, and shakes a lot of pollen loose. And they also tend to visit the same kind of flower throughout their foraging trips, which ensures that pollen will be transferred to the same species and not pollen from one species being wasted on another. And then there are also flowers that are adapted to this, like turtle heads, for example, where only the bumblebee has the strength to get inside that flower. and foraging there. But other insects are important. They may not be as efficient as bumblebees, but they're far more numerous and far more diverse. And so they matter. They all matter in their own ways. It is worth asking, how important is pollination to a garden? And in a way, you might say not that important, because in a garden like Thuya, where we deadhead, seed production is sort of a non-issue. Because that's the whole point of pollination, is produce seeds for the next generation. Well, we deadhead and seed production. We do that partly because the plant puts its energy into more flowers rather than seeds or fruits. And so, but it is important for the ecosystem as a whole. And that's why it matters. This is an aerial view of Thuya. You can see we're surrounded by woods. Many of our gardens in Maine, including mine at home, constitute what they call edge habitat. And it's where two habitats meet, and often it's forest and something else. And so you get a mix of species from one habitat and the other, both coexisting. Plus, you tend to get, I don't know why I keep doing that. Plus, you tend to get plants growing that are kind of not part of either one. For example, at the forest edge, you'll see, modest sized shrubs that don't grow deep in the forest, or they may not be in the field. At my house, that's where I find like chokecherry and spirea and stuff like that. They're right at the edges there. And so the diversity of plants and insects is higher. And that too has been studied. Pollinator diversity is highest in edge habitats. And that's what a lot of our gardens are, which means we have a great opportunity to help things along, if you will. So we're gonna, at Thuya, we see some things like, this is a pine elfin, which is a forest species. We've seen the common ringlet, which is a field species. And they're both right there because we have kind of both of those, and it sort of congregates and where all the flowers are. So that's just an illustration of the diversity you can get in that edge. And then, so who are the pollinators that we see? That's what I'm going to go through the rest of the talk. And what do they need besides nectar? And one thing I should have, I want to pause this slideshow. Anyways, I don't know why it's on the timer, but a lot of insects, well, all insects have larval stages. We know them as caterpillars, grubs, maggots. And for a lot of insects, those life stages may last longer than the adults we're familiar with. And they actually may be more important in their ecological roles than the adults are. To get an extreme example, we all know Luna moths. Well, the adult Luna moth doesn't even have moths. They don't feed. So in the grand scheme of things, of energy flow through the ecosystem, the adult doesn't really matter, except as a means to produce more caterpillars. And that's sort of the way we think about insects. It would be helpful if we think beyond the adults, because the larval stages are sometimes more important. Bees, like I said, they're the big ones. We've recorded 13 species, which really isn't that much. North America has almost 4,000 species of bees. And Maine, the state of Maine produced a bee atlas, which is pretty cool. It's a dry document, but it's they recorded almost 300 species in Maine. So our measly little 13 doesn't seem like much, including over 150 in Hancock County. So bee diversity, bumblebees, as you can see, we've recorded 5, which is pretty good. And Bombus was misspelled there. It should be Bomb US. So sorry about that. One kind of bee we see is the cuckoo bee. And you may be familiar with cuckoo birds who lay their eggs in other birds' nests. Cuckoo bees lay their eggs in other bees' nests. But they are pollinators. Their primary victim is the mining bee, which is a little tiny thing, about a 1/2 inch long. I love these things. We see these even when there's snow on the ground. They're like one of the first things to emerge in the spring. So they are important pollinators for early spring flowers. And there's over 50 species of bee. We've seen one. We think they're very hard to identify, but they, like the name implies, they nest in the ground. And so, if you're familiar with Thuya Garden, we have the lower pavilion with the crushed rock surface. That's where they are. And that, because of the sun, that part, the snow often melts first. And as soon as the snow melts, they come out. They're really kind of neat.
Are they the same as ground?
Well, ground bee, I think, is just a more generalized term for things that nest in the ground. Because some bumblebees will nest in the ground too. Yeah.
And they're sting, right?
I don't know. I mean, most of the time when we have bee stings at Thuya, almost every time it's because, well, we're like deadheading. We grab a flower not knowing there's a bee in it. And we'll talk about stings a little bit, wasps, but these things, when they're foraging, they really don't care about you. You get right up to them. They're not aggressive. I don't know. They probably have a stinger, but I honestly never had the pleasure of experiencing a sting.
My dog and I were chased when we accidentally fumbled on a ground nest, and
Could have been
we had
wasps.
to run,
Yeah.
and they covered my dog.
I get the one time I was stung by a wasp it was down near our boat landing. I was digging holes to plant some little trees, and I actually dug right in the wasp nest, but it was really mild. It was like a honeybee sting. It wasn't that bad. But anyways, and then there's these are really things. These are only like 1/4 inch long. These little sweat bees, and so there's the diversity of bees is really high, and it's a lot more than bumblebees. That brings us to wasps, and that's the one that most people go. And there's wasp diversity is really high. Also, they rival beetles as far as how many species there are. The thing that's important about wasps is that they're, unlike bees, which feed their young pollen and nectar, wasps feed their young prey. And they, like, for example, this species feeds its young on moth caterpillars. And some wasps will do it by laying their eggs directly on the victim, or sometimes they'll sting the victim, paralyze it, bring it to their nest. There's different ways of doing it, but it's kind of a gruesome way to make a living, but it is important ecologically. If you think about the food web and things eating other things, and they play a big role in that. This group, the Vespidae, includes the ones that most people have had bad experiences with. Hornets, yellow jackets. And the reason is they're colonial. And so if you get near their colony, they will defend the colony. And sometimes just being near it is enough. Other times, you have to like touch it or something, but it depends on the species. Some are more aggressive than others. But when they're foraging, they're not going to waste a stinger on you if you're not near their nest. So when we see them in the flowers, it's like, okay, no big deal, And wherever they're nesting, good luck to them. But they can serve as pollinators without being a threat to humans. And then, just like cuckoo bees, there are cuckoo wasps. And this is a little guy that it lays its eggs in a different kind of wasp nest. It's called the digger wasp, kind of like the mining bee, you know. And but it's pretty cool. And then this is the thread-waisted wasps, which are, you know, I find wasps really beautiful. Actually, they're the different colors and patterns on them. This family, they feed their young on caterpillars, but also crickets, katydids, grasshoppers, things like that. And then spider wasps, as you can imagine, feed their young on spiders. And then this, the Ichneumonidae, I think I said that right. That's a pretty big group, and they feed their young on sphinx moss and other members of the family, things like beetles. So this is all part of this food web where things are eating other things, and that's what, you know, makes the web strong. So that brings us to beetles. We've recorded quite a few different kinds of beetles, but not all of them feed on flowers. And the larvae of beetles do other things. And for example, this one is known as a chestnut. I mean, this is the chestnut bark borer, and they feed on wood. Actually, I'm sorry, I think I got that wrong. But the larvae feed on dead and living hardwood. So it's part of the food web with the decomposers and things like that. This one is the, it doesn't have a common name, but it feeds on wood, mostly dead and decaying wood. So the recycling of that material in the ecosystem, the beetles play an important role. This group is called the longhorn beetles, and we've seen 12 different species in this family visiting flowers. There's also other beetles. This is a Cantharidae, which are soldier beetles. The larvae are predators of things. And the adults will take nectar, pollen, but they also can be predators too. So they play multiple roles, even as adults. And so that brings us to flies. And flies are pretty cool. And there's a lot of flies that visit flowers. And some of them, you know, a little surprising. This is the type of flower fly. This one here is a bee fly. And as you can see, it kind of looks like a bee. And they buzz around. And they're pretty efficient pollinators. Their young are raised by, it's another nest parasite of the mining bees that we saw before. So a lot of things seem to pick on the mining bees. If we see bee flies, it's a good sign. That means we have a lot of mining bees. This is a blue bottle fly, not a very lovely critter. And the name is, the Latin name is Calliphora vomitoria. And oddly enough, Calliphora means bearer of beauty. So bearer of beauty vomitoria. It's a carrion, it feeds on carrion. It lays its eggs on, you know, dead things, but they also take nectar. So that's also a potential pollinator. Tachinidae, parasitic flies, also known as bristle flies sometimes, as you can see by the abdomen with the spiky things. They are, as their name implies, their larvae are parasites on other things. In fact, tachinids are often important biological controls for pests because they can be very specific on what they, what they lay their eggs on and their larvae feed on. And we see a ton of these on the flowers at Thuya. This is a deer fly. I know we don't like those,
Mm.
but actually this particular species doesn't feed on blood, or isn't known to. And this one, if you look carefully underneath the fly, you can see this one is actually being killed by a spider. So spiders are important predators in the garden. Sometimes they kill things, you know, we like, and sometimes they kill things we don't like. But they, but even the species of deer fly that feed on blood, that's only the females. The males don't feed on blood, and they'll take nectar and therefore visit flowers. And same is true with mosquitoes. It's only the female mosquitoes and so forth. But the biggest group of flies that visit flowers are the flower flies, the syrphids. And these are really cool. A lot of them have these black and yellow patterns. They're wasp mimics, probably to deter predators. They're usually pretty small. They come in a variety of shapes. They're really lovely little things. It's just they're so small that we often don't notice them. The important thing with the syrphids, the flower flies, is their larvae are predators, and they feed on a wide variety of things: mites, caterpillars, mealybugs, whiteflies, adelgids, thrips. But their main prey is aphids. Those little, because it's a larval fly, it's considered a maggot. Those little maggots are predators. And this one is getting an aphid off a plant. And so I like to think of that as like, well, a lot of people would like to get rid of all the aphids. Well, if you did that, you'd get rid of your flower flies too, because they depend on them. So even aphids, there's about 1,400 species of aphids in North America. About 300 of those are introduced, but only about 80 of them are considered pests. So it's not like every aphid out there. In fact, as a general rule with most insects, the ones that are pests are generally the ones that are introduced. You know, the native ones tend to have a predator that keeps them in check, and they don't cause a lot of problems. So now we're on to the Lepidoptera. This is moths are a big group. There's over 10 times as many moth species as there are butterflies. And recent research has shown the moths are actually more important to pollination than they had been given credit for. A lot of them are night flying, so people don't notice them, you know, but they are important. You can see the long tongue, which also butterflies have, allows them to get nectar. We've recorded quite a few. And with moths and butterflies, their host plants, they can be very specific on their host plants. If you've ever had the pleasure of hearing Doug Ptolemy give a talk or read his books, he lays it out very nicely that the survival of moths and butterflies depends on native plants, because they're very often very specific on which plants they can use for their young. This is a sphinx moth. This is a laurel sphinx moth. The Latin name, it's called the laurel sphinx moth, but the host isn't laurel. And it's actually a misnomer. The Latin name has calmia in the species name. It's Sphinx calmia. And people thought it was a laurel sphinx moth because calmia is a species of mountain laurel. Well, it's actually named after a guy named Calm, who was a student of Linnaeus. And so it's sort of a little mess up, but they're actually hosts are things like ash trees, things in that family. And we've recorded 6 different species of sphinx moths. Geometer moths, I don't know why they're called that. They're the ones that we most think of when we think of moths. They're more typical. This is a cranberry spanworm moth. and its hosts are granaries. This family are the clear-wing rope borers. This is a maple callus borer, so it feeds on maples, but it's kind of an unusual look for a moth. There's this family is pretty varied. They're Rebidae. I picked these two because the one on the left is a yellow-colored scape moth, and the one on the right is a Virginia tenuca. And they look quite similar, actually. Both of these are thought to be mimics of some other insect that's toxic. So mimicry is kind of a big thing, but probably a beetle that's not pleasant to eat. And so it's a way to deter predators. And both of these feed on grasses and sedges. Their larvae do. So that brings us to the butterflies, the ones people most often think of. And this is a great spangled fritillary. All the fritillaries around here depend on violets for their larvae, not the flowers, the leaves. So that's what their larvae feed on, are violets. And we've tried to plant a lot of violets to help these things along. But the adults, of course, visit flowers, take nectar. The family that most people are familiar with is the brushfoot family. It's called brushfoot because their front legs are not used for walking. They kind of have like brush-like structures on them. Who can tell? This is the American lady, and it feeds on various species of Asteraceae. We're going to skip over a lot of butterflies, even though I have a lot of good pictures, because they could take all day. But a lot of them you're probably familiar with the admirals and the painted lady and various things like that. But some of the more ones we don't see as often, this is the Harris checkers block. Its host plant is fairly specific with flat-topped white aster. And this is a common buckeye. We've only seen this a couple times in Thuya. It's mostly farther south. And it feeds on plants in the Plantagenaceae and Acanthaceae. One family of butterflies that you may be pretty familiar with is the skippers. They have this characteristic posture where the hind wings are kind of flat and the forewings are raised up. And this is it's called the Indian skipper, unfortunately, I'm putting a name there. And its host plant is grasses. So I think it's interesting that a lot of these butterflies and moths, which we see visit flowers, depend on grasses, that for their host plants. So when I get somebody at the garden who says, I want to plant a butterfly garden, what should I do? I usually start off by asking, well, do you want to attract butterflies or do you want to help them? And it's not the same thing. You can plant nectar plants and they'll come and visit. But a lot of times what they need most are host plants from caterpillars. So that might mean grasses and sedges, or it might mean other things. For example, the silver spotted skipper here, it feeds on leguminous plants. Its larvae do. Again, not the flowers, the leaves. We have the yellow ones that you see flying by that never seem to sit still. Those are the sulfurs. We recorded 3 kinds. This is the orange sulfur. 2 of the species we had, orange and clouded, feed on leguminous plants. A 3rd species, the pink-edged sulfur, which is now the state butterfly of Maine, blueberries. That's what it requires.
Is there a little bug on that one? No, or is that just another spot?
I think it's
a spot.
Yeah. So this is one of the azures, which you're probably familiar with, the ones that, when they're flying, you see this really nice blue, but when they sit, they hold their wings up and you can't see the blue. So it's hard to get a picture of the blue part. This is the Lucia azure, which again, is a blueberry specialist. One thing I just learned not that many years ago is after June, the azures we see, even though they look the same to me, are a different kind. It's a summer azure. And its host plants are things in the rose family, like meadowsweet. There's American copper, which feeds on various things. The eastern populations of American copper may be introduced from Europe because there's a western population, quite a bit up north, which has different host plants. So this may have been introduced by the original colonists.
Just a question about the antenna, because they have such interesting pattern on it. I mean, is that a sort of a function at all, or?
Probably, yeah, detect chemical signals,
The black, the white.
either pheromones or the plants, I don't know enough about it, but I'm always amazed at how, like monarchs, how good they are at finding, milkweed. It's kind of shocking, really. The last butterfly plant they talk about here is the swallowtails, and we see swallowtails all the time. It's there are two species we see regularly. This one is the eastern tiger swallowtail. Host plants are things like sweet bay, black cherry, things like that. And then a similar looking species is the Canadian tiger swallowtail. And if you have a good picture and get a good look, you can tell them apart. But sometimes when they're just flying by, and its host plants are things like birch, aspen, black cherry. And then a couple of years ago, I wasn't working, my head gardener was working, and she saw this. And she knew it was something different. And it wouldn't sit still. It was hard to get a photo, but this is a still from a video she shot. This is an eastern giant swallowtail. This thing is bigger than a monarch. It's a big butterfly. And after we determined what it was, I looked online, different resources, and as far as I can tell, this might be the first record from NBI. In fact, there are very few records from Maine. It is a southern species. Its host plants are trees in the citrus family. And in fact, in Florida, they're considered a pest. But somehow there is one kind of tree, the hot tree, which is also known as wafer ash, which does range up into Maine, but not in this area. This thing was probably just a vagrant. But I like this because it pays to pay attention to what's flying around your yard, because you might see something unusual, as well as the usual things, which are kind of cool in themselves.
Rick, is there a black swallowtail?
There is a black swallowtail.
That's what I see.
We've seen, yeah,
They're huge.
we've seen them. We have seen them in Thuya. I don't have a good photo.
Yeah.
And these are all macro pictures you take in your garden?
Oh, I'm going to get to that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So what can we do to help them besides help pollinators besides nectar plants? Big thing is minimize chemical use. We try to follow organic pest practices, but we're even getting stingier and stingier with organic pesticides like neem oil, because it is a very powerful pesticide. And then also we've learned that some things that we didn't think would matter do. So for example, herbicides and fungicides will harm pollinators, So like bees, just like humans, they have a microbiome in their gut. And if they ingest, an herbicide, it's going to adversely affect them, even kill them. It may not be immediate, but it will do them harm. So the less chemical use, the better. As you may have gathered from what I've been saying, native plants and the more diverse, not just the species, but the structural diversity. Actually, this is when the planting was new, so there isn't much structural diversity. But now if you're to visit our boat landing, we have everything from ground cover to trees and everything in between. the structural diversity is important, and it helps a lot. Another thing is the ground. So leaf litter, dead wood are winter, especially wintering habitats for a lot of insects. So we try not to go nuts with the leaf cleaning anymore. We get it off the lawn, because we don't want to kill the lawn. We just blow in the woods and leave it, because there are things that will spend the winter there. And as much as we can without making the place look too, too grungy, we'll leave dead stumps, dead logs, because again, when I mentioned the beetles whose larvae are feeding on those, but also there are bumblebees that will nest in wood. So basically, the less cleanup we do, kind of the better. You have to balance that with the aesthetics, and then of course bare ground too. The things like those mining bees, they're not going to dig through the leaf litter, So if there's bare ground, it's good to leave that too. Really, one thing that's not very helpful is bark mulch. It doesn't do the insects very much good. It's hard to get through, and you're better off with leaf mulch, actually. And then in the winter, we have stopped cutting down our stalks of our perennials. Stalks that are pithy or hollow, insects winter in those. Now, I did read something recently that said it's mainly the first 18 inches or so. And what they were recommending is you could cut it into pieces, let it fall on the ground, and decompose, but leave the last 18 inches. What we do is we leave the whole thing up, and we just clean it up in the spring instead of fall. And if we have to clean it up before the weather warms, we'll cut those stalks and we'll just lay them aside so that whatever's in them can emerge after it warms up. Yeah.
This year I heard that you are supposed to cut them after you have 5 days in a row of 50-degree weather. Is that so the insects can?
Yeah, that's so, when it warms up enough for them. Yeah.
I mean, that's late.
Yeah, it can be late. That's why we cut them, and we have an area where we just lay them down.
Yeah.
It's better than
Right.
composting.
Right.
And then a big thing is to be tolerant of herbivorous insects. And there's a lot of things feeding on plants. And the way I look at it and try to remind myself, if I'm on a hike somewhere and I see, a wild plant, whether it's a red maple or, an iris or something, a wild native plant, and I'm admiring it, I keep in mind that at that point in time, there are things feeding on it. Anything, maybe dozens, it may be thousands in the case of certain kinds of trees. And the plant's okay. And they're adapted for that. And so tolerating a little bit of insect damage, and there's several cases of Thuya where, oh God, something's doing this. And we say, okay, well, let's just wait and watch it. And the problem doesn't get so bad that it kills the plant, but we find out it's doing some good, it's providing food. So photographs, yes, about photographs.
Yeah.
Except for the aerial shot, which was Jay Gibb at the bottom there, it was all done by myself and my staff. I'm the only one that uses a regular camera. My staff, it's all phones. And so I encourage you, when you're walking through your garden and you have a phone that takes pictures, be ready, just take something. And there's some resources. I tend to use Bug Guy because that's what I'm used to. Other people swear by iNaturalist. There's other, and I also like to collect books, so I got a bunch of field guides.
Yeah.
But I always try to, corroborate my identifications, usually with Bug Guy. But there are also like Facebook and Reddit groups that will help with identification of certain things, and apparently they can be really helpful too. So I encourage people to go out there, try to take some pictures. I know for my staff, it's sort of infected everybody, you know, where it's added another layer of appreciation for the garden. And we, you know, we're always, you know, texting each other saying, oh, I found this really cool thing. And here's a picture I took of something, you know, it's really fun, you know, the garden is a lot more than just, you know, flowers then. And anyways, I think that's about it. I appreciate you listening, and thank you.
Open up some questions. What is in question? I think we start with. Yes, Priscilla would like to know, what is the eastern giant swallowtail going for that slide? And you know.
Oh, see, gosh. This is Priscilla Hutton.
I'm not sure.
She used to be the head gardener. I think it might be a zinnia.
That's all.
Yeah, but it was flying around, you know, in different parts of the garden. It was hard to get, you know, any image because it would just sit still.
Priscilla.
Oh, different Priscilla. Yes.
Explain to me that you haven't been to enough cocktail parties, or you would know that there's really only one insect that people are interested in, which is the brown-tailed moth. What do you suggest? Really? What do you suggest people who have brown-tailed infestations, that again, it's everybody in the room?
Yeah,
What do you do?
what I do at my home is what little I can do. I try to cut out the nests when I see them. And of course, I have an orchard ladder and an extended, you know, little clipper thing on an extension. So I can reach up like maybe 20 feet. And, but anything higher than that, I can't get. I'm out of my yard this year. I took down about a dozen nests and I didn't get them all. And I haven't heard of a really good organic way to do it. I just cut the nests out, put it in soapy water.
Yeah.
And just, you know.
Another thing I know we did at where we do with step is you cut, then you cut out the tent, and then you put it in a plastic bag and seal the plastic bag up. And if it's, you know, warm, if the sun is out, then basically you're frying the groundhog moths in that bag. The other thing is you can burn them as well if you have fire. That, but it's the best thing to do. We've been doing is to put them in a plastic bag and just seal up the plastic bag and then just put it aside. It's just suck it.
What I've heard people say is that you also can spray for them, which I would guess.
Oh, no.
This year.
No.
Yeah, it kind of depends on what you, I mean, I wouldn't go that way.
Soapy
And
water.
also. there should
If
be-
soapy water might work, but I don't, the ones in the nests, might-
Yeah.
I don't know if the soapy water would get in there.
It's so.
You know, I submerge it in soapy water.
You know anything about that?
Well, I'm sorry.
Tap into the tree, pump some.
Yeah.
I would not want any systemic. Yeah.
You put it at the wrong cocktail party.
No, that's one of the problems with them
Yeah.
is that, yeah,
Nobody likes it.
it's an introduced species and they have no natural predators here. And that's part of the problem. I have heard that their numbers are less in wet springs. I think our wetness this year came too late. And I've also heard that some areas where they used to be really bad are not as bad anymore. So maybe there's population fluctuations. I hate to just hope for the best, but I also would caution that there are other web forming caterpillars, like, you know, tent caterpillars and stuff, which are not as irritating as a brown-tailed moth. They will defoliate parts of the tree, but it's really extremely rare for those things to kill a tree. It just makes a tree look ugly for a year or so.
I have another suggestion.
Yeah.
So for the caterpillars in the spring, you miss the opportunity to get those nests off of your limbs. I actually now have on my little deck that's in the middle of the woods, right? But
I take tweezers and just pluck them and put them in a mason jar with soapy water, and I kind of keep a count going. I'm like, I'm gonna teach you to swim. And so you just pluck it, but I have like a dedicated, I got my little kit out again with all my $50 counts, etc. And I thought, oh, we got this. And I actually did see one this year after I think I got 43 last year. Just crawling around, and so this year I so far only have one. It could be because of the water, because of the moisture, but you know, I'd like to think that 43 didn't go make a nest.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think that's a good point, sometimes it's best not to look for a silver bullet. But just, you make a dent in it
yeah.
and to keep it up and, and then it can make a difference in the long run. Yeah.
I'm from away and I've been coming 15 years and we're in an RV. And I just want you to know, I think more education could occur from the state at the visitor centers and maybe television, little flyers or something. Because when we were in Rockport, our trailer, I mean, I could not believe it. They were all over the picnic tables, the trailer, they were on our truck tires. And this was the first time we'd ever seen them. And somebody just at the office happened to mention that they'll, sting you and things like that. We didn't know this. And then I knew we were coming here. And I said, well, I'm going to get every one of these things off of everything that they're on our trailer, our truck, our tires. And I really had to spend time getting them off so that I didn't transport them here. And I think there's also a lot of people that bring wood from Maine, from South Maine to here. And I'm kind of surprised there wasn't more education about it as a traveler.
They do put the word out about firewood.
Yeah.
A lot of people ignore it, but they
Right,
do.
Yeah.
They
But
strongly
the
discourage
truck
people.
tires, I
No,
mean,
that's a very good
that
point.
they need to do, I didn't even know what it was. I just thought, oh, it's a caterpillar. And then I went to the office and they said, oh, those are bad things and we're trying to get rid of them and they're hard to kill. And they educated me, but I don't think if I had asked, I would have known and I would have driven right up here to Scudic and then over here and brought them all in.
That was the caterpillar.
Yes.
phase of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm unaware of it because I'm from away.
And the state does want to know
Yeah, they
when
did.
you find.
Oh,
where you
really?
find so that
They were
can keep the
infested
data and
there.
track them. I have seen in other areas of Maine where they've already been identified in areas, especially in like sort of hiking paths or whatever, that there are posted signs telling people about the brown, tailed caterpillar and what to avoid and that sort of thing, what to do. So as far as that education, the state's not going to be able to help you unless they know where that is as well, because it isn't everywhere.
Right.
So they need to keep, they need that data.
Well, some more education on Create. I mean, I watch Create a lot. And we stop in the visitor centers and collect brochures and flyers, those people that answer our questions. I think a little more
Great.
public
That's-
education.
That's a great, actually, that's really great. That's really a wonderful thing to get information.
Did you have a question back there?
I have a question about the violets that you mentioned that the butterflies like to feed on the leaves. Any particular type of violets?
There's quite a few native violets and when I looked it up, like in books and website, it just said host plant violets. It didn't specify which kind. So I would say, it might not matter. But you probably would better off with native violet species than, some cultivar or anything else. But I'm not sure, it's the specificity is often unknown. Yes.
You have an opinion on no mow May. Some people are saying don't mow your grass in May because the pollinators and other insects can nest. And then other people say when you do that and you encourage them to nest and you mow your grass and destroy the habitat at the end of May, they're gone. So it seems to be a big controversy.
Yeah, I mean, last year I didn't mow in May. This year, You know, it's just like dandelions everywhere. And I mean, dandelions, they're a weed, they're an introduced weed, but they're not particularly invasive. They basically stay in the lawn. But they're not exactly, I mean, at Thuya, we have to worry about how things look. They're not really a lovely plant, except the flowers, you know. So this year I didn't follow that. And I've heard people say, oh, let the clover, but really clover blooms after May for us. So I just ignored it this year. I think it's kind of a feel-good thing. You know, I think if you were so inclined, you'd better off reducing your lawn and planting other things. But you know, like at Thuya, I can't really do that much. You know, the garden design is what it is. So, yes.
I leave a lot of dandelions in my field because they're reputed to be good for pollinators. As food, my question to you is, do you consciously plant on a schedule so that you have food continuously for your pollinators through the summer, spring and summer?
Okay, so at Thuya, well, most people come to see are the borders, the flower borders. And you know, the perennials bloom when they bloom. My head gardener, when she designs it, you know, she does try to, you know, get it so there's always stuff blooming. But we're still planting our annuals. So really, like early season, we're not relying on the borders very much for flowers. Outside of the borders, over the past several years, we're planting more and more native plants, and a lot of those are spring ephemerals. So actually, early in the season, we're starting to get quite a bit of things, whether it's marsh marigolds near our pond, or you know, little things in the woodland path. You know, we're getting more and more things blooming before the borders get going, and not to mention, you know, things like shad trees and stuff, which bloom pretty early. You know, so I don't think there's any, with regards to the lawn, I don't think we're adding much value by, you know, having the dandelions out there. You know, I have a lot of dandelions in my house because my wife likes them, you know, and so.
Right. Good for salad.
Yeah. And so, you know, we're just, we're trying to plant more and more native things, a lot of which do bloom early. And of course, late season blooming is not a problem around here. A lot of things bloom late in the year. Yeah. I'm sorry? Colt's foot? I don't think we've planted any yet.
I mean, we just. Can you get rid of them?
Oh, how do I get rid of I'm not familiar with it. I'm not sure if we don't have it or yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Are there any plants that we shouldn't plant because they repel pollinators, things to put in our garden? It is very much.
I'm not familiar with any.
They're very invasive. No, I know the invasive, but I'm just thinking plant that I was thinking invasive so much as I was considering. Is there something that really repels or keeps in more important pollinators away?
Nothing that comes to mind. I mean, I'm not an entomologist, you know, so there might be something, but nothing I'm familiar with. Yeah, it's more like you said, invasives. Those are a bigger problem. Yes.
Yes, we have the old timey milkweed, a huge patch of it. And it gets a lot of sun and shade. And it's probably the third year. And I've never seen caterpillars on it. I see the butterflies, the monarchs flying around it and landing. And it blossoms, you know, it blossoms.
It is one. It's one.
It's the broad-
That's the common milkweed,
the common-
Syriaca.
Two other varieties, that are tall and skinny. I don't know what kind they are.
So you've never seen the caterpillars, right?
No,
And do you know if you've ever seen the eggs? Would you know what they look like?
No, and I looked, and like at Eagle Lake, there's at the entrance to the Parish Road, there's a patch, and they're always covered, with caterpillars and feeding on them, and, I'm just wondering, but.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't run into that.
I think they're getting eaten by birds and spiders, because I'll see it in my yard, I'll count like maybe a dozen eggs, and I'll go back the next day, and they're all gone.
Huh.
They're all gone.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're definitely being
wow.
eaten.
We've had cases where the caterpillars disappeared.
Oh, yeah. they
You know,
disappear
things
too.
like soldier beetles and stuff,
Yeah.
or assassin bugs, or,
I've
we'll take
seen
'em.
chipmunks eat caterpillars.
oh, do they?
Oh, yeah, they jump right up and grab the caterpillar right off the.
Wow.
But you know, it's all part of that food web.
Yeah.
But you know, the milkweed thing is fascinating because, you know, like I said, if we tolerate some insect damage, people don't mind when the monarch caterpillars eat the milkweed down to a nub. But by God, if there's some little, you know, leaf damage on, you know, on their zinnia or something, it's like, ah. You know, it's our human perspective is kind of off a little bit, but, you know, and milkweed is, I have a lot of the Syriaca too, and I love it. It's very fragrant for one thing. And the amount of things that visit those flowers, you know, bees, flies, butterflies, and but interestingly, the only thing that pollinates it are bumblebees. You know, the pollen packets are such that only the bumblebees can transfer them. You know, so a lot of those things are just going to get nectar. It's foraging. But you know, I didn't realize that until a few years ago when I read it. No, I just always assumed monarchs. No, it isn't monarchs. They're just getting, you know, just getting some food and laying eggs. So the monarchs need milkweed more than the milkweed needs monarchs.
Yeah.
Look at it that way.
I had just one more. I heard a story or read an article about how we don't even know all the entomology, all of the insects that are out there, but it's the largest species on the earth. And we don't even have an idea or a clue as to how many they are, how much we're losing, you know, because we can't really count them all. And then within the insect world, I understand that the beetles are the most prominent.
Yeah,
In
beetles-
terms of
beetles and
numbers,
moths, yeah,
the most
beetles.
number. And so I just thought that was really interesting because you don't really think of them that way. I had no idea that it was such a large
Oh,
part of
it's
the-
huge. And in
the
fact,
habitat and our planet.
and even an area like, you know, the northeastern US, which has been inhabited for, you know, by, you know, Americans for a long time. Just a few years ago, a state researcher, she found a new species of wasp,
Yeah,
you know.
they said, there's
We-
millions of them.
And then and the other thing I wish I knew more about, if you go into the soil,
Right,
it's even more uneven. And that's really, yeah, the soil is
Soil
like
science.
supporting the whole thing.
right,
And we know so little about the, you know, the fungus down there,
yeah.
the nematodes, the insects, it's all sorts of stuff. Is that it?
Thank you for sharing your
Well,
knowledge.
thank you, guys.